Hi, warriors. The moment you apologize for who you are, you hand someone else the map to control you. And most people do it every single day without ever realizing what they've actually surrendered. Think about the last time someone made you feel like you were too much, too loud, too ambitious, too direct, too emotional, too intense, too quiet. And what did you do in that moment? You shrank. You said sorry. You adjusted yourself to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. And right in that single moment, something shifted in the power dynamic between you two, and that person felt it. They registered it. They stored it. Because that's where the dark psychology begins. Not in some dramatic confrontation. In the quiet moment you made yourself smaller. See, the people who tell you to apologize for who you are, they are not doing it out of concern for you. They are doing it out of strategy. And the most unsettling part is that most of them don't even consciously know they're doing it. But the mechanism they're running is ancient. It has been used by kings, by warlords, by abusers, by corporate structures, by lovers, by families, and by entire systems of social control for thousands of years. And the mechanism is devastatingly simple. Make someone feel ashamed of themselves, and you own them. You don't need chains. You don't need threats. Shame is the most efficient leash ever invented. There is a concept in dark psychology called identity erosion, and it doesn't happen in one moment. There's no dramatic event where someone sits you down and announces that they are going to dismantle your sense of self. It happens in the smallest, most ordinary moments. A raised eyebrow when you speak too confidently. A subtle sigh when you take up space. A comment that arrives wrapped in humor. You're so sensitive. Why do you always have to be like that? No offense, but that's a really weird way to think about things. Don't you think you're overreacting? These micro-corrections, these tiny social adjustments they demand of you, they accumulate, they stack. And what they build over weeks and months and years is a person who no longer just apologizes with words. They apologize with their entire existence, with the way they enter a room, with the way they speak, with what they choose not to say. And here is what dark psychologists and Machiavellian thinkers understood, that the entire self-help industry will never tell you. Because the self-help industry profits from your insecurity. When you apologize for who you are, you don't just lose confidence. You become predictable. And a predictable person is a controllable person. These are not separate consequences. They are the same consequence. Predictability is control. The moment someone can accurately forecast how you will behave when pressured, when shamed, when excluded, they have leverage over you that they never need to announce. They just use it. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince that a ruler who constantly seeks approval from others will never hold real power. Not because approval is worthless, but because the act of seeking it exposes your pressure points to anyone paying attention. It reveals exactly where to push to make you bend. And once someone has located those pressure points, they never need to force you into anything. They just apply the correct social pressure, and you do the work yourself. You bend, you apologize, you adjust, all on your own, and they never even had to raise their voice. Think about how this plays out in the world you already live in. There is always that one person, in the office, in the friend group, in the family, in the relationship, who never apologizes for who they are. Not because they are reckless or cruel, but because they have understood something about power that the people around them were never taught. Every time they act without apologizing for their nature, they establish dominance in the social environment, not through aggression, through certainty. And certainty, in the language of human behavior, reads as authority. It reads as status. It reads as someone worth following, or, depending on who's watching, worth fearing. Either way, it reads as power. And power attracts. Power commands attention. Power determines how a room moves. Now, let's go deeper, because the real dark psychology here is not simply about confidence. It is about what happens neurologically and socially in the person who watches you apologize. When you shrink, when you say sorry for taking up space, when you soften your personality to accommodate someone else's discomfort, something happens in that social exchange that is invisible but permanent. The other person's brain runs a rapid, automatic recalibration of social hierarchy. In that single moment of apology, your social rank registers as lower, theirs registers as higher. You didn't just say sorry, you submitted. And submission in the human social hierarchy, exactly like in every other primate social structure that has ever been studied, is permanent data. Once someone has seen you submit, they carry that information into every future interaction with you. Every conversation, every negotiation, every disagreement from that point forward is filtered through the memory of that submission. This is precisely why the most dangerous apologies are not the dramatic ones. They are the quiet, casual, habitual ones, the ones that happen in the middle of an ordinary conversation without any fanfare. When you laugh nervously and say, "Sorry, I just tend to overthink things." When you begin a sentence with, "I know I'm probably wrong, but," when you preface an opinion with, "I don't want to cause any problems." When you add, "I'm just saying," at the end of something you actually believe. Every one of those phrases is a submission signal, and every person in earshot, consciously or unconsciously, is reading it and updating their understanding of where you stand in relation to them. Robert Greene, in the 48 Laws of Power, articulates this in one of his most devastating laws: never appear too eager and never reveal your needs. Because the moment someone sees your need for their approval, that approval transforms into leverage. And leverage in the hands of someone who understands social dynamics is not just advantage. It is a leash with which they can direct you without you ever seeing the hand that holds it. But here is where the psychology gets genuinely dark, because the people who are most skilled at making you apologize for your own existence, they very rarely look like manipulators. They look like the most caring, most loving, most concerned people in your life. They approach you with warmth in their voice and worry in their eyes. They say things like, "I'm only telling you this because I care about you. I say this because I love you. I just want what's best for you. I'm worried about the path you're on." And what they are actually executing beneath the warmth is one of the most sophisticated manipulation tactics ever documented. They are framing your identity itself as a problem that needs to be corrected. And framing is everything. Framing is the entire game. The moment someone succeeds in making you accept the frame that who you are is a problem to be fixed, you've already lost, not the argument, the relationship, the dynamic, yourself. This specific tactic has been documented extensively in cult psychology research, in coercive control studies, in behavioral influence, literature spanning decades. It's called identity reframing, and it works because of a simple asymmetry. You can argue with someone who disagrees with you. You can push back against criticism. You can defend a position. But how do you argue with someone who is worried about you? How do you push back against concern? The moment the manipulation is framed as care, your defenses have to lower because resistance feels like ingratitude. And that paralysis is exactly what the tactic is designed to create. And the most corrosive outcome of long-term identity reframing is that eventually the victim begins to do it internally. They begin self-correcting before anyone else says a word. They preemptively apologize for themselves before entering a room. They rehearse quieter, safer, softer versions of their actual thoughts before speaking. They perform humility not because they feel genuinely humble, but because they have learned through painful repetition that existing fully is dangerous. That being completely themselves invites punishment. What looks like social grace from the outside is, on the inside, a trauma response that has become automatic. Now, let's examine what happens with the people who simply refuse to do this. The ones who genuinely never apologize for who they are, not because they are self-deluded, but because they have made a clear and deliberate decision. Because this is where dark psychology reveals something that most people find deeply uncomfortable. The people who refuse to shrink are not always the people with the highest self-esteem. They are not always the most secure, the most loved, the most validated. Sometimes they are simply the people who have looked at the deal being offered, which is, make yourself smaller and we will accept you, and they have decided that the price is not worth the product. They have done the calculation, and they have walked away from the offer. In the Machiavellian framework, this is described as the willingness to be hated. Machiavelli was explicit about it. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot have both. But the deeper reading of that statement, the one that modern political psychology has excavated, is this: the moment you prioritize being liked over being real, you have compromised your structural position. You have made yourself dependent on a resource, which is approval, that someone else controls, and any resource you don't control is a vulnerability. People who seem untouchable, who seem immune to social pressure, who seem to exist in a kind of impenetrable self-containment, they have understood this. They have accepted, without bitterness, that some people will be uncomfortable with who they are. They have accepted that some environments will not welcome them. And instead of treating that discomfort as evidence that something is wrong with them, they treat it as information. It tells them something specific about the person who is uncomfortable, not about themselves, about the person reacting, about what that person needs, about what threatens them, about whether the dynamic is worth investing in. And most of the time, the information says no. And this leads to one of the most important observations in the study of influence and behavioral control. The people who have mastered the refusal to apologize for themselves do not experience their lives as battles. They experience them as clarity. Every relationship they enter is filtered through a simple, invisible test that runs automatically. Does this person want me, the real version, or do they want a managed version of me that makes their life more comfortable? And based on the answer to that test, they know exactly how much to invest, how much to trust, how much to reveal. They are not cold. They are not calculating in the way that word is usually meant. They are simply operating from an accurate map of the social world rather than the flattering, distorted map that social conditioning hands to most people at birth. Now, the question this naturally produces is, doesn't this level of awareness make genuine connection impossible? If you see every social dynamic through the lens of power, how do you ever actually trust anyone? And this is where dark psychology, when understood correctly, becomes genuinely liberating rather than isolating. Because the people who operate from this awareness are not incapable of real connection. They are actually capable of deeper connection than almost anyone else. Because when someone who never apologizes for themselves chooses to let you in, chooses to show you a real version of their interior life, you know it is not performance. You know it is not a bid for your approval. You know it is not a transaction. It is genuine, and genuine is rare. Genuine is what most people spend their entire lives desperately searching for, while their own social anxiety and approval seeking behavior makes them completely incapable of offering it in return. There is a critical distinction that must be made here, because without it, this entire framework can be misread as an excuse for selfishness or cruelty. There is a profound difference between apologizing for who you are, for your personality, your values, your nature, and taking genuine accountability for the things you actually do, the actions that cause real harm, the choices that damage people who did not deserve to be damaged. These are not the same thing. Accountability is moral clarity. Accountability is the recognition that behavior has consequences and that those consequences matter. But that is radically different from apologizing for your personality because it makes someone uncomfortable. One is integrity, the other is submission. And the most skilled manipulators in any social environment have very deliberately blurred the line between these two things to keep the people around them in a permanent state of confusion about which one is being demanded of them. They engineer situations where you genuinely cannot tell if you are being held accountable for something you did or being punished for existing in a way that is inconvenient for someone else. And as long as that confusion holds, you will keep apologizing for both, which means you will keep surrendering power you never needed to surrender over choices you never needed to second-guess for people who benefit from your confusion. The psychological antidote to this, as dark psychology prescribes it, is not aggression. It is not coldness. It is not arrogance. It is ruthless precision. A specific, internal, non-negotiable clarity about what you are and what you are not, about what is genuinely yours to account for and what is someone else's emotional management dressed as your responsibility. And once that clarity is fully installed, something changes in your social dynamics in a way that most people never anticipate. The people who were using social pressure as a tool of control begin to pull back. Not because you've become hostile, not because you've become cold, but because they have encountered a boundary that isn't emotional and therefore isn't negotiable. It doesn't fluctuate based on mood. It doesn't soften based on relationship history. It doesn't bend under the application of guilt or concern or disappointment. It is structural. It is built into how you move and how you speak, and, more powerfully, how you don't react. And structural boundaries are the only kind that social manipulators genuinely cannot work around. This connects directly to what behavioral researchers call non-reactivity, and it is one of the most powerful positions a human being can occupy in any social dynamic. Think about the people you have encountered who simply did not seem to need your opinion of them, not in an aggressive way, not in an arrogant way. They just operated from a self-contained energy. And what happened in you when you encountered them? Almost certainly one of two responses. Either you were pulled toward them with genuine fascination, or you were deeply unsettled by them, possibly both simultaneously. Because a person who does not need your approval has removed your most fundamental social tool from the interaction. You cannot reward them with validation. You cannot punish them with disapproval. You cannot move them with guilt. The entire standard toolkit of social influence becomes useless. And that is disorienting to people whose sense of self is built around being needed or being followed or being feared. In group dynamics, this produces a predictable and repeating pattern. The person who consistently refuses to apologize for themselves becomes either the most magnetic person in the group or the most aggressively targeted, often both, depending on the audience and the moment. Because the group, any group, recognizes at an instinctive level that this person is operating outside the normal system of social reward and punishment. And every social group, from a high school hallway to a corporate leadership team to a family system, requires participation in its hierarchy to function. When someone refuses to participate in that hierarchy on the group's terms, the group must decide. Either they absorb this person and accept the disruption to the existing power structure, or they attempt to eliminate them through social pressure, ridicule, exclusion, or ostracism. And those elimination tactics, look carefully, are exactly the tools designed to make you apologize, to make you say sorry, to make you come back into the fold smaller than before. Watch this pattern play out in the world around you. It is everywhere. It operates by the same mechanism in a kindergarten classroom and in a geopolitical negotiation, because the mechanism is not cultural, it is not learned, it is biological. It is written into the deepest layers of human social behavior, going back to our earliest tribal structures, where conformity meant survival and nonconformity meant exile. The tribe needed unity to survive. Deviation was a threat. And the biological legacy of that reality is that human beings are still, in the 21st century, running ancient software designed to detect and punish deviation from the group's expected behavior. Every time you feel the pull to apologize for who you are in a social situation, that is ancient software running. Recognize it for what it is. not moral guidance. Tribal programming. And here is the final, most uncomfortable truth that dark psychology arrives at. After everything, after all the layers of social manipulation and power dynamics and behavioral control, the people who most aggressively try to make you apologize for being yourself are the people who are most frightened by what you represent. Not because you are dangerous to them in any practical sense, but because you are free in a way they have forgotten how to be. And freedom, to a person who has built their entire sense of self around social acceptance, around fitting in, around being what the group needs them to be, freedom is the most threatening thing imaginable. Because if you can exist fully and unapologetically and not collapse from the social pressure, if you can stand in the discomfort of being disliked and keep going, it means that the framework they've surrendered their entire identity to maintain isn't actually necessary. And confronting that would mean confronting the prison they built around themselves with their own hands. So instead, they attack your freedom. They call it arrogance. They call it selfishness. They call it immaturity. They dress their attack in the language of concern, and they wait for you to apologize. Because your apology is not just social compliance. It is confirmation that they were right to imprison themselves, that the sacrifice was worth it, that the cage is necessary. Do not give them that confirmation. And understand this one final thing, because it is the point that almost everyone misses when they first encounter these ideas. The goal is not to become someone who cannot be moved. The goal is not emotional stone. The goal is not to build such a thick wall around yourself that nothing and no one can penetrate. That is not power. That is a different kind of prison. The goal is something far more precise. To know at all times whether you are moving because you genuinely chose to move or because someone else applied pressure and you responded automatically the way you were trained to respond. That distinction between chosen movement and conditioned response is the entire game. Most people live their entire lives inside conditioned responses and call it personality. The ones who understand dark psychology learn to pause at that threshold, to ask the question, to see the mechanism, and then, with full awareness, to decide. Machiavelli, Nietzsche, Green, they were not teaching cruelty. They were not building a philosophy for predators. They were documenting something far more fundamental about how human power actually operates in reality beneath the surface narrative of morality and social grace. They were saying, know the game. Not so you can play it viciously, but so you can never again be played without your awareness. The world will spend your entire life trying to tell you who to be. Every system, every institution, every relationship has a preferred version of you. A version that is easier to manage, easier to predict, easier to slot into the existing order without disruption. And the pressure to become that version is constant and sophisticated, and very often invisible because it arrives wrapped in love, wrapped in concern, wrapped in shared values and community belonging. And the people applying the pressure are often not lying. They often genuinely believe they are helping you, because they made the same deal themselves, and it cost them everything they were, and they need you to make the same deal so the cost feels justified rather than catastrophic. The darkest truth in all of this is simply that most people never see it happening. Most people spend their entire lives becoming incrementally smaller, one apology at a time, one social correction at a time, until the person they present to the world barely resembles the person they were born as. And they call this process growing up. They call it maturity. They call it wisdom. They call it knowing how to be in a relationship. They call it being a team player. Dark psychology calls it something else. It calls it the successful completion of social control. The subject has been fully domesticated, not through force, through consent, through 1,000 small surrenders that felt like kindness and looked from the outside like someone who finally learned how to get along. So the next time someone makes you feel like you need to apologize for being exactly who you are, before you open your mouth, before you shrink, before you reach for that habitual sorry, before you water yourself down one more time, pause. Run this question through your mind, not out of hostility, not out of arrogance, simply as clarity. Whose power does my apology serve? Look at the dynamic. Look at who rises and who sinks when you submit. Look at who needs you to be smaller and ask yourself why your size frightens them. Ask yourself what they lose when you refuse, because this is the knowledge the most powerful people in history refused to unlearn. Power is not taken from strong people by force. It is surrendered quietly, one apology at a time, by people who forgot that they had a choice. Every time you apologize for who you are, something transfers, something real, something that accumulates. And by the time most people begin to understand how much they've given away, they've been apologizing for so long, they've lost the memory of what they were before the surrendering began. You do not have to make that deal. You never had to. And the fact that the entire social world around you has been quietly, consistently, persistently, and sometimes lovingly pressuring you to make it anyway should tell you everything you need to know about why your unapologetic existence is exactly as threatening as they've always told you it is. The discomfort you create simply by being real, by refusing to shrink, by occupying the full space of who you actually are, that discomfort is not your problem to fix. It is their map of the world colliding with someone who refuses to fit into it. And that collision is not a failure. That collision is proof that you are still intact. Never apologize for being yourself. Not because you're perfect, not because you're always right, but because the moment you do, someone else writes the terms of who you're allowed to be. And those terms will never be written in your favor. That's not cynicism. That's not bitterness. That's dark psychology. And now you know exactly how it works.